At the age of 70, Mel Gibson is still remembered as one of the most profoundly influential figures in the history of modern cinema. He was once the face of Hollywood for many decades, an iconic action star, and at the same time the director behind films that shocked the entire world. His career exploded when he was still very young with the role of Max Rokitansky in Mad Max, the movie that became an international phenomenon and took his name far beyond Australia's borders. Not long after that, Hollywood quickly recognized his unique charisma, and the role of police officer Martin Riggs in Lethal Weapon turned Gibson into one of the world's most beloved action stars. But his ambition didn't stop at acting. In 1995, Gibson stunned all of Hollywood when he directed and starred in Braveheart, the epic about warrior William Wallace. The film won 5 Oscars, including Best Picture and Best Director, elevating Mel Gibson to the ranks of the greatest filmmakers of the era. After that, he continued to create another milestone with The Passion of the Christ, a controversial religious film that still grossed over $600 million worldwide. With a string of successful works, the total box office of films he was involved in exceeded many billions of dollars. And for many years, Mel Gibson was regarded as one of the most powerful names in Hollywood. But behind that spotlight was a life full of wounds and mistakes that made the whole world turn its back on him. The fame that once lifted him to the top was also what made his fall more painful than anyone else's in Hollywood. Personal scandals, angry outbursts, and moments of losing control turned the man who once stood at the peak of glory into the center of criticism. There was a time when the doors of the film industry almost slammed shut in his face. Studios stayed away from him. Many friends in the industry went silent. And the name Mel Gibson, once spoken with admiration, was now mentioned with caution. But what makes his story different is not just the downfall, but the ability to rise again after losing everything. During those years of isolation, Gibson had to confront his own mistakes, loneliness, and long nights when fame no longer shielded him. It was in that period that he began to rediscover the calm, humility, and determination that had once helped him rise from the tough early days of his career. And then, with persistence and the belief that people can change, he gradually returned not as a perfect man, but as a man who had gone through pain, learned his lessons, and was determined to prove that even when Hollywood turns its back, a person can still stand up and keep moving forward. If the story of Mel Gibson makes you curious about what really happened behind the Hollywood spotlight, subscribe to the channel right now to join us in continuing to explore his tumultuous journey. After the blinding lights of Hollywood and the unanswered questions about the fall of a legend, Mel Gibson's story has to go way back into the past, to a time when no one could have imagined that little boy would one day become one of the biggest names in world cinema. Mel Gibson was born on January 3, 1956, in Peekskill, New York, into a large family with 11 siblings. Their life was never easy. The house was always noisy, cramped, and sometimes chaotic, where the kids had to learn to grow up faster than their age. His father, Hutton Gibson, was a tough and extremely strict man who believed discipline was the only way to raise children in a dangerous world. Family rules were clear and rarely broken. For Mel, childhood wasn't carefree afternoons playing in the park, but long days trying to please a father he always wanted to prove he was good enough for. But then, in 1968, when Mel was just 12 years old, a major event happened. The Gibson family decided to leave the United States and move to Australia. For his father, it was a protective decision, a way to keep his sons from facing the Vietnam War later on. But for Mel, it was the moment his whole world collapsed. In a short time, he lost everything familiar: his home, his friends, the familiar street language of New York, and the feeling of belonging somewhere. As the ship left the dock and America slowly faded behind, Mel Gibson didn't know that his life had just entered a completely different chapter. Australia, for that 12-year-old boy, was a strange new world. New school, different accents, unfamiliar faces. In class, Mel often felt like an outsider. He spoke differently, acted differently, and that quickly made him the target of teasing and bullying. Those first days at school were long and heavy. There were afternoons he came home in silence, trying to act strong in front of his family. But inside was a loneliness that a child could hardly put into words. Mel didn't just lose his homeland. He lost his sense of belonging. And that feeling, the feeling of always standing on the sidelines, followed him for many years afterward. During his growing up years in Australia, Mel began to change. The loneliness gradually turned into rebellion. He became hot-tempered, quick to anger, and sometimes ready to fight just to prove he wasn't weak. Teachers remembered him as a smart but hard-to-control student, a boy who always carried intense energy that no one knew what to do with. But beneath that tough shell was a heart searching for a place to belong. Mel Gibson later admitted that his young years were like an inner battle, where he both wanted to be accepted and felt the world was always on the opposite side. It was during that time that anger and loneliness became two constant companions. Few people know that those powerful emotions would later become the energy that helped him create vibrant characters on screen. But at that moment, the boy Mel Gibson only knew one thing. He no longer belonged to New York. And he had never truly felt he belonged to Australia. And sometimes, it's the people who don't belong anywhere who are destined to shake the whole world. Those years of feeling lost eventually led Mel Gibson to a turning point that even he couldn't have expected at the time. As a young man still trying to find his place in the big world, Mel applied to the National Institute of Dramatic Art, or NIDA, in Sydney, one of Australia's most prestigious acting schools. Ironically, submitting the application wasn't entirely because he believed he would become an actor. There are stories that his sister actually sent the application for him, almost as a test. No one thought that hot-headed, troublemaking boy would fit on stage. But when Mel walked into the audition, something happened. The emotions bottled up for so many years, anger, loneliness, the feeling of being abandoned, suddenly found a way out. And for the first time in his life, Mel Gibson felt like someone truly saw him. But getting accepted into NIDA didn't immediately turn him into a model student. On the contrary, Mel's early years at the school were full of chaos. He still carried all the anger of his youth. He drank more than he should, got into arguments, and sometimes even fistfights. Those who studied with him remembered Mel Gibson as someone with such intense energy that it was hard to control. He could be incredibly charming, funny, and magnetic one moment, but a single wrong word could make him explode. Teachers sometimes looked at him with concern, because they saw real talent in this young man, but they also saw a storm forming. And that storm could destroy everything if nothing held it back. What held Mel back was acting. When he stepped onto the stage, all the chaotic emotions inside him seemed to have a place to exist. The roles allowed him to say things he couldn't express in real life. When he shouted in a scene, it wasn't just dialogue. It was the voice of the boy who left America in tears, of the young man who was mocked in class, of a person who always felt like he was standing outside the world. Acting became the only place where Mel Gibson felt truly heard. No longer the lost boy. No longer the hot-tempered guy underestimated by others. On stage, he could become anyone. And strangely enough, it was precisely when he became someone else that Mel Gibson began to understand his true self more clearly. However, at that time, no one at NIDA thought that this intense student would become a movie star. Hollywood was very far away back then, almost like another planet. The other students seemed more stable, more disciplined, and had clearer paths ahead. Mel didn't. He still carried the cracks of his youth nights of drinking too much, impulsive arguments, moments when anger seemed stronger than reason. But it was precisely those cracks that made him different. When Mel performed, people didn't just see an actor reciting lines. They saw a real person, with all the intense emotions burning in every movement. And gradually, the teachers began to realize that behind that chaos was something rare, an actor capable of making the audience believe every emotion on his face. The years at NIDA didn't make Mel Gibson's anger disappear, but they gave that anger a direction. Instead of destroying his life, it began to become fuel for his art. He was still the impulsive guy, still made mistakes, still had long nights when alcohol and insecurity made everything blur. But alongside all of that, a dream started to take shape, not the glamorous dream of fame or money, just a simple dream to stand in front of a camera, to tell stories, to turn the chaotic emotions inside him into something meaningful. And at that moment, no one could have imagined that this hot-tempered student, the one who had once been lost between two continents, who had fought in bars and drank more than necessary, would one day become one of the biggest stars Hollywood ever produced. But sometimes, legends don't start with perfection. They start with a wounded person trying to find their way in the dark. The years at acting school gradually passed, and Mel Gibson began taking his first steps into the world of cinema that had previously seemed so out of reach. After graduating from the National Institute of Dramatic Art, he landed a few small roles on Australian stages and television. Nothing in those early days suggested that a storm of fame was approaching. Mel was still just a young actor trying to find opportunities, carrying within him the hot temper and intense energy that many still didn't fully understand. But then an unexpected event happened, an opportunity that he later admitted changed his entire life. A young Australian director, George Miller, was looking for actors for a low-budget, post-apocalyptic action film called Mad Max. The story of a lone cop in a collapsing world wasn't a project Hollywood was paying attention to at the time. It was just an experimental film shot in Australia on a modest budget. Mel Gibson showed up to the audition in a pretty unique state. The night before, he had been in a fight, and his face was still bruised. He looked almost like someone who had just walked out of a street brawl. When Gibson walked into the casting room, many people thought he had come to the wrong place, but what they didn't expect was that his appearance caught the director's eye. The bruised face, the cold stare, and the intensity in his eyes made him look perfectly suited to the harsh world the film was trying to create. At first, Miller even asked Gibson to come back in a few weeks, when the wounds on his face had healed. But the image of that young man haunted him, and in the end, Mel Gibson was chosen for the role of Max Rakitansky, the central character of the story. When the film was shot, no one on the crew thought they were creating a phenomenon. Mad Max was made on a very small budget, and most of the action scenes were done under pretty dangerous conditions. But it was that rawness that gave the film its soul. When Mad Max was released, it quickly became a shock to audiences. The movie delivered a brutal world full of speed, violence, and emotion. And at the center of that storm was Mel Gibson, a face almost no one had known before. In a short time, the film became an international phenomenon, breaking many box office records relative to its production budget and launching Mel Gibson's name around the world. For Gibson, everything happened too fast. Just a few months earlier, he had still been a young actor in Australia, trying to find roles to survive in the industry. But after the film's success, he suddenly became a sought-after face. The press started writing about him, producers started noticing him, and Hollywood, the power center of the film industry, also began looking toward this young man. Fame came to Mel Gibson like a storm. It didn't knock slowly. It crashed in, sweeping him into a whirlwind of lights, praise, and enormous expectations. But behind that explosion was a truth few people saw. Mel Gibson at that time was still just a young man, still carrying all the wounds of his childhood, the unhealed anger, and the insecurities he had never truly faced. Fame can turn a person into a legend in the public's eyes, but it doesn't erase the inner battles within that person. And when Mad Max put him on the world cinema map, Mel Gibson had hardly had time to understand what was happening to his life. One day, he was still the acting student with long nights full of chaos. The next day, he had become the star of a film the whole world was talking about. That was the moment everything changed, because from that second onward, Mel Gibson was no longer just a young actor in Australia. He had become an icon in the making. But sometimes, people who are thrust to the top too quickly haven't had time to prepare for the weight of that very peak. And when the Hollywood spotlight began shining directly into his life, that not yet ready young man was thrown straight into a world where every mistake was magnified. Every victory was celebrated, and every crack in his soul could become a future storm. After the explosive success of Mad Max, Mel Gibson's life entered a completely different chapter. Hollywood, always on the lookout for fresh faces with powerful charisma, began paying attention to the young man from Australia with his intense eyes and unpredictable energy. In the early 1980s, Gibson started appearing more frequently in international projects, but it wasn't until 1987 that one role truly turned him into a global icon. That film was Lethal Weapon. In this movie, Mel Gibson played Martin Riggs, a talented but deeply wounded Los Angeles cop after the death of his wife. Riggs was a character full of contradictions, dangerous yet pained, capable of laughing one moment and ready to charge toward death the next. That complexity made the character stand out from the typical Hollywood action heroes. And Mel Gibson, with all the intense emotions inside him, seemed born to embody that role. Audiences around the world quickly fell in love with Martin Riggs. They didn't just see an action hero, they saw a man fighting his own pain. The scene of Riggs standing in front of a gun, trembling on the edge between life and death, became one of the most memorable cinematic moments of the 80s. Gibson brought a raw authenticity to the character that made audiences feel every emotion was real. And in a short time, Lethal Weapon became a box office phenomenon. The film didn't just succeed once. It spawned an entire franchise that stretched over many years, with each new installment reinforcing Mel Gibson's position as one of Hollywood's biggest stars. The name Mel Gibson started appearing everywhere. Movie posters, magazine covers, television shows, and red carpet premieres. He became the face of a new kind of action hero, not perfect, not invincible, but a real person with real wounds. Audiences didn't just admire him, they felt close to him. In the public's eyes, Mel Gibson was the hero the whole world loved. But the bright lights of fame often hide the dark corners few people see. Behind the smiles, in front of the cameras, was an enormous pressure gradually weighing down on his life. Success came so fast that Gibson barely had time to pause and understand what was happening. New projects kept coming. New films, interviews, flights between continents. The packed schedule turned his life into an endless whirlwind. And in that world, where everyone always expects you to be strong, entertaining and perfect in front of the lens, Mel Gibson began turning to something that seemed to offer temporary relief: alcohol. At first, it was just drinks with friends after a long day of shooting. But over time, alcohol started appearing more and more in his life. Late nights, extended parties, moments when he wanted to shut out the noise of fame. Gibson kept working, kept delivering performances that thrilled audiences, kept bringing in millions of dollars for the studios. But inside, cracks began to appear. The hero the world adored on screen was quietly facing silent battles in real life. Fame has a strange way of magnifying everything. It turns success into legend, but it also makes mistakes many times bigger. And as Mel Gibson's fame continued to rise, his outbursts of anger, moments of losing control, and growing drinking habits started becoming part of the story the public hadn't yet seen. From the outside, he was still Martin Riggs, the reckless hero audiences loved. But in real life, Mel Gibson was gradually stepping into a phase where he no longer fully had control over his own life. And sometimes, the biggest tragedies of a legend don't start with a sudden fall. They begin very slowly, almost unnoticed, until everything has gone too far. In the years following the success of Lethal Weapon, Mel Gibson's name had become one of the most powerful brands in Hollywood. He wasn't just the action star audiences loved, he was an actor capable of bringing rare emotional depth to commercial films. However, inside Mel Gibson at that time still existed a greater longing. He didn't want to spend his entire career remembered only as a man holding a gun on screen. He wanted to tell big stories, stories about courage, about sacrifice, about people who dared to stand up against fate. And that longing led him to the most ambitious project of his career, Braveheart. When Mel Gibson decided to direct and star in this film, many in Hollywood were skeptical. Braveheart was an expensive epic telling the life of Scottish warrior William Wallace, a historical figure largely unknown to American audiences at the time. Studios worried the project was too risky, but Gibson believed in the story. He believed audiences would understand the profound message about freedom and courage the film carried. The production process was incredibly grueling. Massive battle scenes were shot in harsh conditions in Ireland, with hundreds of extras, freezing weather, and a shooting schedule that stretched over many months. As director, Gibson carried enormous pressure on his shoulders. As lead actor, he still had to throw himself into those staged battles with all his energy. It was a challenge that nearly exceeded what one person could endure. But Mel Gibson kept going, day after day, as if he were fighting for his own dream. When Braveheart was released, what happened next far exceeded every expectation. The film captivated audiences worldwide with its grand battle scenes and powerful emotions. The image of William Wallace shouting "Freedom" on the battlefield became one of the most famous cinematic moments of all time. Audiences didn't just see a historical story, they saw a message about human courage in the face of oppression. And at the center of it all was Mel Gibson. In 1996, at the Academy Awards, Braveheart won triumphantly with several major awards, including Best Picture and Best Director. For Mel Gibson, it was a moment very few artists ever achieve. He was no longer just a movie star. He had become a filmmaker respected around the world. In the moment he stood on the Oscar stage, Mel Gibson seemed to have reached the peak of every dream an artist could imagine. From the boy who left America feeling lost, from the hot-tempered student at NIDA, he now stood before millions of viewers worldwide with the golden statue in his hand. Hollywood honored him. The press called him a genius. Studios were ready to hand him their biggest projects. At that time, Mel Gibson had almost everything: fame, power, money, and the respect of the entire industry. But Hollywood history has a cruel rule that few notice when they're at the top. The highest place is sometimes also the starting point of the most painful fall. Because when a person reaches the height of glory, the world begins to look at them with impossible expectations. They are no longer allowed to make mistakes. They are no longer allowed to be weak. And for Mel Gibson, the inner battles within him, his anger, his insecurity, his habit of turning to alcohol to escape pressure, had never truly disappeared. They were just hidden by the light of success. Braveheart lifted him to the very top of Hollywood, but it also unwittingly placed him in a dangerous position. Because when the whole world sees you as a legend, they will also be the ones who witness most clearly when that legend begins to crack. And Mel Gibson, having just conquered the peak of cinema, could not know that far bigger storms were still waiting ahead. After the glory of Braveheart, many believed Mel Gibson's path would continue to be paved with victories. He had reached a height most artists only dreamed of: a box office star, an Oscar-winning director, a person with real power in Hollywood. Studios were ready to give him major projects, enormous budgets, and absolute trust. But Mel Gibson had never been the type of artist to follow the safe path. Inside him, there was always a powerful urge to tell stories he believed were important, even if they made the whole world argue. And that very urge led him to the boldest decision of his career. He began making a film that almost no major studio dared to touch: The Passion of the Christ. It was a high-risk project. The film recounted the final hours of Jesus Christ's life, but unlike any religious film before it, Gibson wanted to tell the story in the most raw and intense way possible. He decided to use ancient languages like Aramaic and Latin, making the film alien to mainstream audiences. He also didn't shy away from the story's pain. The torture and crucifixion scenes were depicted with a level of realism that left many stunned. When the project became known, Hollywood's reaction was almost immediately cold. Many studios refused to get involved in production. Some critics said the film was too violent. Others worried it could spark serious religious controversy. But Mel Gibson kept going. In the end, he decided to finance the film himself, out of his own pocket, a massive personal investment that few directors would dare to make. When The Passion of the Christ was released, the film world was almost split in two. For many audiences, the movie was such a powerful experience that it brought them to tears. They called Mel Gibson a courageous filmmaker, an artist who dared to tell a religious story in a way Hollywood had never dared before. But for others, the film sparked outrage. Some critics said it was too brutal. Some religious organizations worried it could cause misunderstanding or division. Debates erupted on television, in the press, and across cultural forums. Mel Gibson, once praised after Braveheart, now became the center of a global storm of controversy. But despite everything, the film achieved success almost no one expected. The Passion of the Christ grossed over $600 million worldwide, becoming one of the most successful religious films in cinema history. Audiences flocked to theaters in huge numbers. Those who believed in the film saw it as a profound spiritual experience. But commercial success could not erase the growing cracks between Mel Gibson and Hollywood. The film industry, always sensitive to controversy, began looking at him with caution. In interviews, Gibson still spoke about his faith and the reasons he made the film, but gradually the previous praise began to mix with suspicious glances. To some, he was a cinematic genius willing to risk his entire career on a story he believed in. But to others, he became an unpredictable, even dangerous figure in an industry that always wants to control its image. And so a distance began to form. Hollywood no longer embraced Mel Gibson with the same enthusiasm as before. Invitations for projects started to dwindle. The handshakes that once came easily now became more cautious. It wasn't an immediate fall. There was no single moment when everything collapsed. But those who watched closely could feel the change in the air. The men who once stood on the Oscar stage with the admiration of the entire industry now began stepping into a different phase where every move he made was scrutinized more closely than ever before. And Mel Gibson, perhaps still unaware that the biggest storm of his life was still ahead. After the controversies surrounding the Passion of the Christ, Mel Gibson's life seemed to enter a tense period of silence. He was still one of Hollywood's most famous figures, but the atmosphere around his name had changed. Interviews became more difficult. The looks from the press were no longer entirely admiring, but even so, few could have imagined that just one short night in 26 would become the most devastating turning point in his life, a night that Mel Gibson himself later admitted changed everything. That night, in July 26, Gibson was pulled over by police in Malibu, California, for driving under the influence of alcohol. At first, it seemed like just an embarrassing incident, but not too unusual for a Hollywood star. But what happened next turned the incident into a global media storm. While intoxicated, Gibson unleashed anti-Semitic remarks at the arresting officer. Those words were quickly recorded in the police report, and when the information leaked out, it spread with the speed of a wildfire. Within just a few hours, major news outlets started running the story. Television channels kept airing breaking news. The internet, which was then becoming a new media powerhouse, was flooded with headlines about Mel Gibson. His drunken remarks were quoted everywhere, and what made everything worse was the context that came before. The Passion of the Christ had already sparked sensitive religious debates. Now, Gibson's words seemed to confirm the fears of those who had criticized him earlier. In just one night, the story was no longer about an actor getting arrested for drunk driving. It became a moral and cultural scandal that spread across the entire world. The change happened almost immediately. People who once praised Gibson began to go silent. Studios that had been eager to work with him now became cautious. Meetings were canceled. Projects under discussion suddenly vanished. Hollywood is an industry built on image. And when that image is damaged, the reaction is usually swift and very cold. Gibson issued a public apology shortly afterward. He admitted he had been drunk and said shameful things. He called those words a terrible mistake and insisted they did not reflect who he really was. But in the world of media, apologies often can't outrun scandals. In the weeks that followed, the pressure on Mel Gibson grew day by day. Organizations spoke out in criticism. Television programs discussed him as a textbook example of moral downfall in the entertainment world. People he had worked with started keeping their distance. Some friends in the industry quietly offered support, but publicly very few were willing to stand by him. Hollywood, which had once opened its doors wide for him to enter, now seemed to close them one by one. For Gibson, it wasn't just a media crisis. It was a profound personal shock. He had once been one of the most powerful artists in the film industry. He had stood on the Oscar stage with the whole world applauding. But now, every time his name appeared in the press, it was tied to the word scandal. Many began speaking of him as a symbol of collapse. Articles analyzed his career with a tone as if the story was already over. Some commentators even suggested Mel Gibson had single-handedly destroyed his own legacy. The most painful thing for an artist isn't always the criticism. Sometimes it's the silence. Phones that once rang non-stop now went quiet. Hollywood parties where he had once been the center now happened without him. Invitations to collaborate gradually disappeared. Gibson, who could once call any producer in the industry and be heard immediately, now began to feel a sensation he had never experienced at this level: isolation. In just one night, Mel Gibson's public image changed completely. The beloved movie hero became a controversial figure. The man once called a genius was now referred to with different words, and even many years later, while Gibson continued to work and seek redemption, the moment in 26 is still mentioned as a major crack in his story, because sometimes a life built over decades can be shaken by just one night when a person loses control of themselves. That was the night many believed Mel Gibson had destroyed his legacy. The night Hollywood began turning its back. The night a cinema legend stepped out of the spotlight and into the shadows of doubt, criticism, and loneliness. And for Mel Gibson, the real battle of his life had probably only just begun. After the shock of 26, Mel Gibson's life didn't stop there. The media storms, the criticism, and the silence from Hollywood forced him to face a phase filled with isolation. But sometimes the greatest losses in life don't come from the public or career, but from the very place that was once a person's source of peace: family. For many years before that, Mel Gibson had still been seen as a family man. He had married Robin Moore in 1980, when his career had barely begun. Robin wasn't part of Hollywood. She was an Australian dental nurse who lived a simple life far from the media lights. For nearly 3 decades, she had stood by Gibson when he was an unknown young actor, when he became an international star after Mad Max, when he conquered Hollywood with Lethal Weapon, and when he reached the peak with Braveheart. Together, they built a large family with 7 children. In many people's eyes, it was one of Hollywood's rare, long-lasting marriages. But cracks had begun appearing long before the world noticed. The life of a movie star is never easy on a family. Long trips, months away filming, the pressure of fame and public controversies started leaving marks on their relationship. After the 26 scandal, the distance between Mel and Robin seemed to grow even larger. The negative media attention made family life increasingly tense. Finally, in 29, Robin Moore officially filed for divorce after nearly 30 years together. The news stunned all of Hollywood, not just because of the end of a long marriage, but because of the enormous financial scale involved in the divorce. With no prenuptial agreement, California law required assets to be split in half. At the time, Mel Gibson's net worth was estimated at around $850 million. That meant Robin Moore was entitled to nearly half. When the divorce settlement was finalized in 2011, the amount Gibson had to pay his ex-wife was estimated at around $400 million, one of the most expensive divorces in Hollywood history. The press called it the $400 million goodbye. But for Mel Gibson, that number wasn't just money. It was a sign that a huge part of his life had come to an end. What hurt more than losing assets was the feeling that a once close family was no longer the same. For many years, Robin Moore had been the one behind the scenes, protecting the Gibson family's private life. She rarely appeared in the press, rarely attended Hollywood events. But when the marriage ended, Mel Gibson didn't just lose his spouse. He lost the stability that had existed for nearly 3 decades. A home once filled with the laughter of 7 children now felt more distant. To the public, the story was often told through huge numbers and sensational headlines, but behind those numbers was a man facing the consequences of years of stress, mistakes, and pressure. Mel Gibson once had it all: fame, money, a large family, and the admiration of the entire industry. But by the early 2010s, much of that had vanished. Hollywood still kept its distance after the scandal. The nearly 30-year marriage had ended. A large portion of his wealth was gone too. There are moments in life when a person has to look back at everything they've built and wonder what really remains. For Mel Gibson, the years after the divorce were a time full of reflection. He was still one of the most talented artists of his generation, but his personal life now resembled a shattered picture. And sometimes, when a family breaks apart, the most painful thing isn't the parting between two adults. It's the feeling that a long chapter of life years built with love, hope, and sacrifice has quietly come to an end. At that point, Mel Gibson seemed to be standing in the middle of a vast emptiness. His fame had been damaged. The family he had once built was no longer whole. The enormous wealth that once symbolized his success was now only a fraction of what it had been, and when looking back on his life, the man who had once stood at the peak of Hollywood probably began to understand that there are losses no Oscar award or box office success can ever compensate for. But fate wasn't done with him yet, because the biggest storms in Mel Gibson's life were still ahead. After the expensive divorce from Robin Moore, Mel Gibson's life seemed to enter a phase more fragile and unstable than ever before. He no longer lived in the familiar family structure that had existed for nearly 3 decades. Long nights, solitary trips, and a growing sense of emptiness began to become part of his new life. During that time, Gibson started a relationship with Oksana Grigorieva, a Russian singer and pianist. At first, their relationship seemed to bring Gibson a sense of a fresh start. Oksana was much younger than him, and her appearance in his life drew attention from Hollywood press. When their daughter was born in 2009, Gibson seemed to hope that his life could move into a different, calmer chapter after all the turmoil. But that hope quickly shattered. The relationship between Mel Gibson and Oksana Grigorieva began to grow tense, then spiraled into a series of public disputes. Back-and-forth accusations appeared in the papers. Their personal arguments gradually turned into a legal and media war. But what made this story one of Hollywood's biggest scandals wasn't just the breakup. It was the secret recordings. In 2010, multiple audio recordings of conversations between Gibson and Grigorieva leaked to the public. In those tapes, Mel Gibson's voice rang out full of anger, sometimes completely out of control. The harsh words, the insulting remarks, and the threats left the public stunned. Media outlets replayed those tapes non-stop. The internet was flooded with the recordings. In an era when news spreads at unprecedented speed, Gibson's angry words were heard by millions around the world. For many fans who had once loved him, it was a huge shock. The man who had once brought deeply emotional characters to the screen now appeared in a completely different light, a man losing control in the grip of his rage. Television programs discussed the incident almost daily. Cultural commentators called it one of the most public meltdowns of a Hollywood star. And once again, Mel Gibson became the center of a media storm he couldn't control. Hollywood, which had already been wary of him after the 26 scandal, now seemed to completely turn its back. Major studios no longer wanted to take risks with the name Mel Gibson. Projects he had once been considered for gradually disappeared. Some producers even publicly stated that working with Gibson at that time was too risky. In the film industry, where public image can determine hundreds of millions in revenue, a scandal like this was nearly a death sentence for any star's career. The isolation Gibson had felt after the 26 DUI now became even deeper. Friends in the industry rarely appeared by his side. Major film premieres, where he had once been an honored guest, now happened without his name on the list. To the public, Mel Gibson gradually turned into a cautionary tale, an example of how fame and anger can destroy a person's career. Those audio recordings didn't just damage his image, they made many people question who Mel Gibson really was. How could an artist who had created films about courage, faith, and sacrifice say such things in his private life? That was the question the press, audiences, and Hollywood kept asking over and over. And for many years afterward, whenever Mel Gibson's name was mentioned, those recordings remained an unavoidable shadow. For Gibson, it was the most painful and humiliating period of his life. No longer were there headlines about box office success or film awards. Instead, there were stories about scandals, legal battles, and personal wars laid bare before the whole world. A man who had once stood at the pinnacle of Hollywood now had to face the reality that his reputation had been almost completely destroyed. And at that point, many believed Mel Gibson's story was over, that Hollywood would never open its doors to him again, that his mistakes had been too great to ever be forgiven. But sometimes the most tragic stories don't end at the point everyone thinks. Because after losing his fame, losing his family, and nearly losing his entire career, Mel Gibson still had one final battle to face, the battle with himself. After the shocking recordings spread around the world, Mel Gibson's life entered a period that few outsiders truly understood. To the public, the story seemed finished. A star who had once stood at the top of Hollywood had destroyed his own reputation. But for Mel Gibson, it was only the beginning of a long and heavy phase, the years when almost no one called him anymore. In the film industry, where projects are often decided by quick calls and power dinners, silence can say everything. Producers who had once constantly sought him out now stopped contacting him. Scripts that used to arrive every week now vanished. Major studios steered clear of him, unwilling to have their names tied to the controversies surrounding Gibson's life. Hollywood never officially declared him banned, but the way they treated him in those years made that feeling clearer than any words could. Mel Gibson was still an artist, still the man who had won an Oscar, still the creator of films loved by millions. But during that period, all of those things seemed no longer enough to reopen the doors of the film industry. He took on a few smaller roles, sometimes independent projects or films he probably would never have considered before. But the big roles, the massive budget projects, the movies Hollywood once eagerly handed to him, all of them vanished. His career didn't end completely, but it shrank to the point where almost no one spoke of Mel Gibson anymore as one of Hollywood's central figures. In those years, his life became strangely quiet. No more glamorous premieres, no more television interviews, no more headlines praising his talent. Instead, there were long days spent in reflection and self-reproach. Gibson later admitted that it was one of the hardest periods in his life. Not because he was no longer famous, but because he had to confront himself with the mistakes the whole world had witnessed. People who worked with him recalled that Mel Gibson during that phase was much quieter than the hot-tempered image the public had once seen. He spent a lot of time at home, staying far from the media spotlight. Long nights became a familiar part of life when he had to think about everything that had happened. The wrong decisions, the words that could never be taken back, the moments of losing control had sent his life down a path he had never imagined before. For someone accustomed to the hectic pace of Hollywood, that silence was sometimes heavier than the criticism itself. Perhaps the most painful thing during that time was the feeling of shame. Mel Gibson had once been one of the most respected artists in the film industry, but now, every time his name appeared in the press, it was more often tied to scandal than to art. For a man who had spent his life telling stories about courage and redemption, having to look back at his own life under the negative light of the media was a difficult challenge. Gibson once said that, in those years, he had to learn to accept the truth, that he had hurt many people, and that there was no way to completely erase the mistakes that had been made. But it was precisely in that lonely period that a quiet process of change began. When there were no more Hollywood parties or the pressure of fame, Gibson had time to think about what really mattered to him. He began speaking more about personal responsibility, about facing the consequences of past actions. Those close to him noticed that even though the wounds from the scandals were still there, Mel Gibson was trying to find balance in his life again. However, at that time, very few people believed he could make a comeback. In the eyes of many observers, Hollywood had already written the final chapter of Mel Gibson's story. A cinema legend who once dominated the box office was now just a controversial name in the industry's memory. But sometimes, it's precisely in the years when the world thinks you've disappeared that a new story is quietly being rewritten. And for Mel Gibson, after many years living in the shadows of isolation, an unexpected opportunity was about to appear, one that almost no one believed he would ever get. After many years of living in silence and isolation, very few people still believed Mel Gibson would have a chance to return to the center of Hollywood. To many observers in the film industry, his story seemed to have closed. A legend who once ruled the box office now only appeared sporadically in small projects and articles recalling his controversial past. But sometimes, film history gets rewritten in moments few expect, and for Mel Gibson, that moment came with a film whose own story carried the spirit of redemption and hope. That film was Hacksaw Ridge. When Gibson agreed to direct this project, many in Hollywood remained cautious. It had been nearly a decade since he had truly helmed a major film. His reputation still carried the scars from past scandals. But the story of the film itself seemed to have a special connection to his personal journey. Hacksaw Ridge told the life story of Desmond Doss, an American medic in World War II. What made Doss different was that he refused to carry a weapon because of his deep religious beliefs. In a military environment where everyone was trained to fight and kill the enemy, Doss chose a completely different path: to save lives. The story of Desmond Doss wasn't about violence, but about courage in a very different form. During the brutal Battle of Okinawa, Doss stayed on the battlefield alone, dragging wounded soldiers out of danger one by one. It was estimated that he saved around 75 lives in a single night, without carrying a gun, without firing a single shot. Only faith, determination, and compassion for others. It was the story of a man seen as weak, mocked, but who ultimately became a hero in a way no one expected. When Mel Gibson took on this film, many began to realize it wasn't just a movie project. For him, it carried deep personal meaning. In the many years before, Gibson had lived with the image of a man who had made huge public mistakes. But the story of Desmond Doss, a man misunderstood, ridiculed, but ultimately recognized for his actions, seemed to mirror part of the journey Gibson was going through. As director, he brought a powerful energy to the film. The battle scenes in Hacksaw Ridge were intense and realistic enough to make audiences feel like they were in the middle of the battlefield. But beneath all that brutality was a very human story about faith and sacrifice. When Hacksaw Ridge was released in 2016, the response from critics and audiences far exceeded many expectations. The film was praised for its powerful storytelling and deep emotion. Many critics called it one of the best war films of the decade, and more importantly, they began talking about Mel Gibson again this time, not as a controversial figure, but as a talented director. At the Academy Awards that year, Hacksaw Ridge received 6 nominations, including a Best Director nomination for Mel Gibson. For Hollywood, it was a remarkable moment. The man once considered nearly impossible to return was now standing among the filmmakers honored at the industry's biggest awards. Not everyone forgot Gibson's past controversies, but the success of Hacksaw Ridge made many in Hollywood start looking at him with a different eye. It was no longer just a story of scandals or mistakes. Now, they saw an artist who still had the ability to create powerful and meaningful works. Filmmakers began talking to him again. New projects were discussed. Not every door reopened immediately. But the long silence that had lasted for years seemed to finally start breaking. For Mel Gibson, this comeback wasn't a loud victory. There were no big statements or extravagant celebrations. But for someone who had gone through long years of isolation, simply standing back in the light of cinema was something special. The story of Hacksaw Ridge, about a man who never abandoned his faith even when the whole world doubted him, seemed to become a symbol of his own personal journey as well. Hollywood can be very harsh, but sometimes it also has the capacity to forgive, especially when real talent is still there. And after many years, living in the shadows of scandal and loneliness, Mel Gibson finally proved that his story wasn't over yet. In fact, it was just moving into a new chapter 1, where the man who once fell in front of the whole world was now trying to stand up again, slowly but steadily, with the hope that past mistakes weren't the only thing defining his life. After the unexpected success of Hacksaw Ridge, Mel Gibson's life seemed to enter a quieter phase. No longer were there the stormy years of scandals, sensational headlines, or prolonged media battles. Instead, it was a time when Gibson began looking back at his life with a calm he had rarely had before. And during that phase, a new person entered his life, bringing a sense of starting over. That person was Rosalind Ross. Rosalind Ross is a young screenwriter who was once a professional equestrian. She met Mel Gibson in the mid-2010s. The age gap between them was quite large. Ross was many decades younger than Gibson, but their relationship developed quietly, away from the noise the press had once attached to Gibson's life. People close to him said Ross brought a piece that Gibson had been missing for many years. It wasn't the glamour of Hollywood, not lavish parties, but just a simpler life where he could be an ordinary person instead of a constantly scrutinized cinema icon. In 2017, an important event happened in Gibson's life. Ross gave birth to his son. The boy was named Lars. To many, this was just a small piece of news in the flow of Hollywood, but for Mel Gibson, it was a moment of deep meaning. When Lars was born, Gibson was over 60 years old. He had gone through a long marriage, a painful divorce, career-shaking scandals, and many years of living in isolation. And now he was a father again to a young child. It wasn't just a new chapter in his life. It was a rare chance to start over. Gibson already had 7 children from his previous marriage to Robin Moore. For many years, he had always said family was the most important thing to him. But the events of his life had caused part of that family to break apart. Becoming a father again, in old age, brought him a different feeling, not the busyness and ambition of a star-conquering Hollywood, but the patience and quiet of a man who had been through enough ups and downs to understand what truly mattered. People who met Gibson during this phase often said he had changed. He still kept the humor and strong energy that were part of his personality, but there was a new calmness added. He spent more time with family, with private conversations rather than glamorous events. Taking care of a young child at over 60 wasn't easy, but Gibson seemed to embrace it like a gift. There were moments when he was seen playing with his son, completely detached from the image of a once controversial movie star. For Mel Gibson, becoming a father again wasn't just personal joy. It was also a way to look back at past mistakes from a different perspective. For many years, he had to face the consequences of impulsive decisions, simmering anger, and moments of losing control. But when looking at his young son, he seemed to understand that life could still go on, that people could still change and learn, even after many mistakes. There was a gentleness in this phase of Mel Gibson's life that few had seen before. The man once famous for intense characters on screen, once controversial for angry words, was now seen in the simple moments of a father, ordinary mornings, outings with his son, small family conversations. All of those things seemed to bring him a peace that Hollywood could never provide. Mel Gibson's life can't erase his past mistakes. The scandals, the controversies, and the losses remain part of his story. But in this new chapter, the man who once stood at the top and then fell to the bottom is trying to do something simple but difficult, become a better version of himself. And sometimes the journey of redemption doesn't start with big public statements. It starts with small moments like when an older man holds his son in his arms and tells himself there's still time to fix what has passed. In the years after his life gradually became quieter, Mel Gibson began speaking more about what had happened in his past. No longer were there tense interviews where he had to defend himself against sharp questions from the press, but calmer conversations where he admitted that his life had gone through major mistakes. For Gibson, the years after the scandals weren't just a journey back to cinema. They were also a journey of facing himself. He once said outright that alcohol had played a big role in the worst moments of his life. For many years, alcohol was how he coped with the pressure of fame, with the simmering anger from his youth, and with the chaos that Hollywood life brought. But over time, he realized that alcohol didn't solve anything. It only made the bad emotions grow bigger. Along with alcohol was anger, something Gibson admits had followed him long before he became a movie star. That anger sometimes made him intense, impulsive, and out of control. On screen, that energy created powerful and memorable characters. But in real life, it caused wounds he had to carry for many years. Words spoken in anger, impulsive decisions, moments when he let emotion override reason, all of them became inseparable parts of Mel Gibson's story. And he understands that no matter how much time passes, those mistakes will never completely fade from the public's memory. But what's notable is that Gibson doesn't try to deny his past. Instead, he often says that people have to learn to face their mistakes if they want to keep living. In many conversations, he emphasizes that no one can turn back time to fix what happened. The words spoken in anger, the actions during nights of losing control, all of it has become part of history. But the only thing a person can do is change the way they live from that point onward. For Gibson, that was the biggest lesson life ever taught him. Fame, he says, is a very fragile thing. One day you can stand at the peak of Hollywood with the whole world applauding. But just one wrong moment and everything can collapse. Mel Gibson experienced that in the most painful way. He was once one of the most powerful artists in the film industry, someone who could turn any project into a major event. But after the scandals, he had to learn how to live without the protection of that fame. And in the process, he realized that fame isn't the most important thing. It can disappear faster than anyone imagines. But if fame can be lost, Gibson believes there's one thing that can always start again: redemption. He never says people can erase the past, but he believes people can change the way they move forward. For many years, he has tried to prove that not with words, but with actions, by continuing to make films, continuing to work, and trying to live a less chaotic life. The success of Hacksaw Ridge wasn't just an artistic victory for him. It was a sign that after all the mistakes and years of isolation, he could still create something meaningful. However, Gibson also admits that the wounds of the past never fully disappear. There are moments when he looks back at what happened and feels a deep regret, not because he lost money or fame, but because he knows his angry words hurt many people. And for a person, realizing they caused harm is sometimes more painful than being criticized. That's why Gibson often says his life is a continuous learning process, learning to control himself, learning to listen more, and learning to accept that he's not perfect. In his later years, looking back on the long journey from the boy who left America to the star of Mad Max, to the Oscar winner with Braveheart, then to the years of scandal and isolation, Mel Gibson understands that his life isn't a simple story of success. It's a story about being human with all the strengths, weaknesses, mistakes, and efforts to repair them. And if there's one thing he wants others to understand, it's this. People aren't forever defined by their worst moment. Fame can vanish. The applause can fall silent. But if a person still has enough courage to look at themselves and start again, their story isn't over yet. And for Mel Gibson, who has gone through both glory and collapse, that lesson is probably the most valuable thing life has left him. After all the years of glory and downfall, Mel Gibson's story isn't like any other journey Hollywood has ever witnessed. He isn't the image of a perfect man. In fact, his life is marked by deep cracks. There were times when the whole world seemed to turn its back on him. There were times when his name appeared in the papers, not for his art, but for painful mistakes. He was harshly criticized, became the center of global outrage. He lost a nearly three-decade marriage, lost hundreds of millions of dollars in the divorce, and for a long time, he nearly lost his place in Hollywood, too. To many, that story should have ended as a tragedy, a great star destroyed by his own decisions. But what makes Mel Gibson different is that he didn't disappear. Before all those storms hit, Gibson had once been an important part of cinema history. As a young actor, he stepped into the film world with the role of Max Rokitansky in Mad Max, a low-budget post-apocalyptic movie that became a global phenomenon. From there, he quickly became a familiar face to audiences, especially when he embodied the complex action cop Martin Riggs in Lethal Weapon, dangerous yet deeply wounded. But Gibson didn't stop at becoming a box office star. He wanted to tell bigger stories, and that led him to one of the most iconic works of modern cinema, Braveheart. The film not only won multiple Oscars, but also etched Gibson's image as an ambitious and emotional director. However, Mel Gibson's life isn't just a story of victories. After the scandals and years of isolation, many believed Hollywood had written his final chapter. But then, something few expected happened. In 2016, Gibson returned as the director of Hacksaw Ridge, the film about medic soldier Desmond Doss. The movie was widely praised and received multiple Oscar nominations, including Best Director for Gibson. For Hollywood, it was a remarkable moment. The man once seen as nearly impossible to bring back was now standing among the filmmakers honored at the industry's biggest awards. It wasn't an erasure of the past, but it was a reminder that Mel Gibson's story wasn't finished yet. What makes his journey special isn't just his cinematic talent, it's his persistence. Many stars facing major scandals disappear from the spotlight forever. But Gibson kept working, kept telling stories, kept trying to prove that people can learn from their mistakes. That doesn't mean his past is forgotten. The wounds of that story still exist, but they became part of the journey, not the ending. When looking back on the long road from the boy who left America with his family for Australia, to the young actor in Mad Max, to the Oscar winner with Braveheart, then to the years of scandal and isolation, and finally to the comeback with Hacksaw Ridge, people begin to understand that Mel Gibson's story isn't a straight line of success. It's a complex arc of glory, mistakes, collapse, and the effort to rise again. And that's exactly what gives his story its special weight, because sometimes the most powerful stories aren't about heroes who never stumbled. They're about people who fell in front of the whole world, who lost almost everything, but still found the courage to stand up and keep moving forward. Mel Gibson isn't a symbol of perfection. He's a symbol of human resilience. The ability to face mistakes, endure consequences, and still press on. And perhaps that's his true legacy. Not just the famous films, not just the cinema awards, but the story of a man who went through both glory and failure, yet refused to disappear. Because sometimes the most powerful stories aren't about heroes who never fell. They're about men who once collapsed and still found enough courage to stand up once more. The story of Mel Gibson makes people feel both heartbroken and unable to help but respect him. He was once an icon of Hollywood, stepping out from powerful roles in Mad Max and Lethal Weapon to reach the artistic peak with Braveheart, the film that brought him the Oscar for Best Director and Best Picture. But what makes his story haunting isn't just the success, it's the painful fall that followed. From the 26 DUI arrest, the shocking drunken remarks, to the nearly $400 million divorce from Robin Moore and the audio recording scandal with Oksana Grigorieva, Mel Gibson went through a period where fame, family, and respect seemed to collapse all at once. For many years after, Hollywood almost completely turned its back on him, and those years when no one called showed the loneliness a person faces when their mistakes are seen by the whole world. Yet it was precisely in that silence that he kept working and ultimately returned with Hacksaw Ridge, the film about medic soldier Desmond Doss's story of faith and redemption. What makes Mel Gibson's story so thought-provoking for Americans isn't that he was perfect. It's that he dared to confront his own mistakes. America has always celebrated the spirit of the second chance. Gibson's life reminds us that talent and success don't make anyone immune to mistakes, but the courage to rise after falling is what truly gives a person value. And sometimes, the greatest lesson a legend can leave isn't how they won, but how they kept living after losing nearly everything. If the story of Mel Gibson makes you reflect on the power of rising after mistakes, please subscribe to the channel and leave a like to support stories like this that inspire. Thank you for watching to the end, and see you in the next video where we'll continue to explore the tumultuous yet resilient lives of legends.